Outwardly, Richard and Margaret Thompson appeared to live an ordinary life, hidden behind routine and respectability. But beneath the surface, something was quietly unraveling. When violence finally emerged, it revealed a chilling truth: that the greatest danger was not a stranger in the dark, but a presence long ignored within the home. The case left behind a lingering unease, a reminder that some horrors wear familiar faces. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. Now, enjoy the stories. My name is Brooke. I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I have been working as a wetlands ecologist down here in Florida's Big Cypress National Preserve. And after I got my degree in environmental science up at UPenn, I moved down to Florida to do a master's on. And this is, putting it as simply as possible, how water levels mess with cypress domes. And then, after a few years, filling out wetland permits and monitoring on behalf of state agencies and consultants, I spotted an NPS job on the USA Jobs website. Government research jobs are always uber competitive, mainly because you get paid to do the thing that you are super into all day. But that does not stop anyone from throwing their hat into the ring, myself included. And with my fieldwork experience giving me an edge, I managed to land a permanent spot at Big Cypress. My work involves a lot of staring at spreadsheets and liaising with state agencies, but I get to do a fair amount of fieldwork too, which has always been my favorite. Sometimes I'm out there tracking water levels or hunting and mapping invasives like the Brazilian pepper. And then sometimes I help plan prescribed burns to keep the pine woods healthy. Or I will do counts on wading birds or alligators, trying to figure out if the canal plugging and rehydration projects are actually working and are not just a waste of time and money. It is hard, sweaty work, and the bugs are by far the worst part. But keeping this wild piece of land healthy makes it worth all the blood, sweat, and tears, even when things get dark out there. And this is the story of the darkest, most disturbing incident of my entire career. Whenever we are doing fieldwork out in the deep swamps, we rely on airboats to get around. And at the time, mine was a 14-foot aluminum flat bottom powered by a big old aircraft engine with one of those big propeller cages on the back. You probably know the thing. It was loud as hell, but that kept the gators away from the boat. And since it could get you places a more traditional boat could not, it was much more preferable to paddling out in a canoe, especially for stuff like collecting mud samples. I used to head out first thing when the waters were still calm. And then, after picking out a sampling site, I would head out with what we call ponars, which are these small hinged boxes that are probably better described as grabbers. You lower it down from the boat, let it sink into the muck, and then a little later, when it is nice and full, you gently pull it back up to capture that soupy bottom layer without too much disturbance. It is all about being careful so you do not stir up the water and skew the data. But half the time, you are either wrestling with tangled vegetation beneath the surface, or in this case, something else. I was out in the swamps, and it was so early that the sun was only just starting to peek up. I was out retrieving the kind of mud samples I just described, which are nice and easy to find thanks to the little floaters attached to them, which bob above the water surface. I'm heading from site to site on my boat, carefully hauling them up, and then moving on to the next. The water was still, the bugs were not bothering me as much, and the only sounds out there were the occasional bird call or gator splash, and so everything else felt nice and peaceful. Collecting those grabbers was going well too, at least until I got to my fourth, which I felt a snag as soon as I tugged on it. It was not unusual for a cord to get caught on a root or cypress knee, and I had a pretty foolproof technique of giving the cord a little slack so I could untangle it. But on this occasion, even after plenty of slack and swaying, the cord still would not budge. I leaned over the side and looked down into the murky water. I am not sure why. I sure as heck could not see anything. I guess I was just wondering what had gotten it so stuck. I gave the cord another couple of wiggles, but as I am doing it, I was thinking, it cannot be a cypress knee. It could not have been any roots either, because I was too far out from the banks. But still, I wiggled the line, hoping that the sample would not spill until suddenly it came loose with a kind of popping sensation. I breathed a sigh of relief and then began gently pulling the grabber up to the surface. I pulled and I pulled, expecting to see the box appear at any moment. But something bigger appeared first and floated right to the surface in front of me. And when I realized what it was, I flew back into the boat so hard that I probably would have capsized it if it were a canoe. I thought it might have been a dead deer or hog or something at first, but to my horror and on closer inspection, I saw that it was no animal. It was a human. It was extremely bloated, rotten to the point of being a bluish-greenish color, and missing its legs below the knee. But even with all that decay, I could tell from its size that the corpse had belonged to a child of approximately 6 to 8 years old. Thanks to the gators, fishes, and turtles that had been eating away at it, the damage and decay were so extensive that I could not tell if it was a little boy or a little girl. And the skin looked like it was sliding off in places, and in others, what remained of its flesh was so infested with bugs that it literally looked like it was moving. The face was half caved in, with empty eye sockets looking back at me and dark tufts of mud-slick hair on what little was left of its scalp. It was festering and covered in slime and mud, and the smell, Jesus Christ, it was like it hit me in the face with this wall of sour rot tinged with swamp gas and death. I tried to stop myself, but it was no good, and I ended up puking my breakfast over the other side of the boat. And then even after I managed to catch my breath and somewhat got myself together, I was still in a really bad way. I should have called it right there, but I had never seen a dead body before, let alone one belonging to a child. And so, I guess I kind of lost my mind for a minute or two, because all I wanted to do was to get the hell away from that body no matter what. I drove the boat back to the dock, tied her up, and then walked straight to my car and drove home, still in shock. And it was only once that I had taken my second shower to try and get the stink off of me that I realized that it was all in my head, and I burst into tears. And by that I mean the smell was all in my head, like I thought that I could still smell the rot, but it was just kind of the trauma talking, if that makes sense, or almost an echo of it or something. Once I pulled myself together, I toweled off and called the cops to let them know what I had found. I was able to give the exact location too, because I dropped the grabber's cord and left the floater at the surface again, so it would not be hard for them to find. A deputy I spoke to said to expect a phone call, and then the next day I got one. I ended up driving over to Everglades City to this missing persons detective who turned out to be this no-nonsense kind of guy who grilled me on all the details. He asked if I remembered any scraps of clothing, jewelry, or distinctive marks that they could use to ID the kid, but nothing stuck out to me. all I could remember was that rotten, stinking, bluish-green flesh and the god-awful smell that seemed like it was burned into my brain. And the detective and I kept in touch for a little while. I was so torn up about the poor kid that he said that I could call to get updates from him, and I hoped that it might solve some kind of long-dead case and that the poor kid's family could finally get some closure. But when I finally did get some news, it was not good. The level of decomposition was so advanced that there was no recovering any usable DNA. There was also no missing kid reports that matched the area or the timeline. So the kid was eventually buried as a John or Jane Doe. And the case went cold. I was devastated. All the nightmares I had being constantly distracted by the memories of it. I thought that it might all be worth it to put an end to some horrible chapter in a family's life, but for it all to be for nothing. And for that poor kid to remain nameless, it just tore me up inside. Even though all these years later, I remember that poor kid sometimes, when I am out sampling, wondering what the hell happened. Was it some kind of accident? Or was the poor kid murdered? And what of their family? I bet they would have given just about anything to know what happened to their child, even if it was such a terrible ending to such a short life. My grandpa was born in Canton when it was still a major stop at the Mississippi Central Railroad. He and his family lived on a little plot just off the square where they could hear those trains rolling day and night. My great-grandpa Elias made money loading and unloading railroad wagons, and it made him a good living for a while. But then the Depression hit, and things got worse and worse for folks around Madison County. Great-grandpa Elias used to get odd jobs fixing the tracks when he could, but the railroad company did not need him at the roundhouse every day like they used to, and he was out of work for months at a time. My great-grandpa took to washing and ironing for $1 or $2 a load from the better-off families in town, while us kids, me and my 2 sisters, helped tend a garden of okra, green beans, corn, and tomatoes. Supper was mostly cornbread and whatever stew meat they could afford, and sometimes money got so tight that they would water down condensed milk for the little ones and mash up leftover greens and water to make a kind of grassy soup, which everyone hated. There was a food program in town, and folks lined up for hours to get their hands on things like meal, grits, salt pork, or cheese. And Grandpa said if it was not for those, some folks would have straight up starved. Grandpa said he remembered how summers used to be fun, but they became all about chores. He and his sisters used to chop cotton, pick berries, or help neighbors around their home for a nickel or 2 apiece. At least the neighbors who had not already moved over to Jackson to seek better opportunities. People started leaving. The town started dying. And it might have even snuffed out the town altogether if it was not for the silver linings that the war brought. It probably sounds pretty dark, but the worst war in human history made a lot of folks a lot of money. Not least the fighting-age men around Madison County who were itching to get back at the Japanese with Uncle Sam lining their pockets. The railroads were busier than ever, and for a while, my grandpa got to work shifts with his dad, loading and unloading railroad cars down at the roundhouse. And it seemed like things were finally starting to look up. But right as they were, some really sinister stuff started happening around town. It started when a whole bunch of German prisoners of war got moved into a place called Camp Clinton, just south of town. Grandpa said that there were about 3,000 POWs in total, and he would sometimes see them working farms or resurfacing roads while under armed guard. People whispered about them, said they were dangerous, and that if they ever broke out somehow, that they might descend on Canton and wreak murder. And I guess people were just scared, as all, because there was never any mass breakout attempt down at the camp. But 2 soldiers did manage to escape, and when they did, there was major panic. There were American soldiers searching all over the county, and Grandpa said he remembered them driving around Canton at night, driving jeeps with searchlights attached to the backs instead of machine guns. They searched section by section, eliminating areas, and closing in on the escapees until there was only one place they had not searched: the swamps out near the Pearl River, just north of the reservoir. Grandpa said it really spooked folks around town, because despite the fact that there was no other place the POWs could possibly be, a thorough search of the whole damn swamp did not turn up a single trace of either escaped prisoner. Soldiers were heard saying how it was like the 2 Germans had disappeared without a trace, and that they might have gotten themselves eaten by gators after wading through the wrong patch of water at night. But that was not the only thing that had people around Canton spooked. Some of the guards from Camp Clinton used to head into Canton to buy cigarettes or candy, or to sink a few beers at one of the bars when they were off duty. Now, one night, a couple of soldiers were in a bar around closing time when they started telling the bartender about something they saw out in the swamp. They were out doing some kind of nighttime search for the 2 Germans, trying to catch them on the move when they thought it was safe to do so. And then, as they had been paddling up and down in the dark, keeping their eyes and ears peeled for any sign of escapees, one of them saw something which turned their blood to ice. 3 ghostly spirits seemed to hover on a nearby bank for a moment, causing one of the soldiers to gasp. He pointed them out to his fellow soldiers, but by the time they had shone their big searchlight on them, the group of pale figures had disappeared. Apparently, the soldier's 2 friends believed his imagination had just gotten the better of him, and they poked fun at him for being such a scaredy cat. But the soldier was adamant that he had not imagined anything, and I guess the bartender must have emphasized that in his retelling, because rumors started going around town that the swamps were haunted. Grandpa said that at first, and embarrassingly enough, he believed the rumors to be true. He was 15, but while he was old enough to work and take care of things around the house, his imagination was still ripe enough for a story like that to take root. After all, those POWs were 2 hardened veterans of the Africa Corps. They had survived war, so the chances that they had fallen victim to nothing but some swampland seemed very unlikely. And even if they were dead, there would be some piece of them left behind to prove it, even if they were only the parts that the gators would not eat. And so if those 2 veterans had just disappeared, what other explanation could there be, if not some kind of terrifying, supernatural one? Folks started warning their kids to stay away from the swamps, and even some grown adults stayed away from the area at night. But not everyone did. An older kid named Caleb Reed, who Grandpa said was around 17 at the time, told everyone that he was going to head into the swamps at night to find out if the ghost rumors were true. His buddies begged him not to go, but Caleb, who claimed that he was an expert in all things related to the spirit world, said that there was nothing that they could do to hurt him, and how they were merely spectral apparitions of dearly departed souls. He said that he might see his old grandpa out there, wandering among the cypress trees, and there was nothing anyone could do to talk him out of it. And so off he went into the swamps under the cover of darkness, and he was never seen again. Yet, another search party was sent out into the swamps. Only this time, it was made up of deputies and volunteers. They searched high and low for young Caleb Reed, and they even dredged the swamp in places that they were able to in hopes of bringing up his body. But no matter how hard they searched, not a single trace of the boy was found anywhere. Now, naturally, the whole Madison County was freaked out by the second sudden disappearance, because while 2 POWs not being found at least made sense to them, having Caleb Reed vanish like he did meant something really bad must have been happening out there in that swamp, and some folks said the escaped Germans were to blame. How they had probably murdered young Caleb after he happened across their little hiding place. And others said that it must have been those ghosts spotted by the soldiers, and how Caleb must have discovered that they were not so harmless after all. But then, to their shock, it was not even a week later that a gator trapper made a horrifying discovery while skinning and gutting his prey, because inside the animal's stomach were human remains. Folks kind of assumed it was poor Caleb in there, and so there was a strange sense of relief when scraps of clothing found in the animal's stomach were determined to have come from a German military uniform, and people believed Caleb might still be out there, lost in the swamps, and would find his way out again any day now. But sadly, that was not to be, and Caleb was not the last one to go missing before everything came to a head. About a week after the German POW's body was found by that gator trapper, a man was driving through the area at night when he stopped his car at the side of the road that ran parallel to the swamps. No one knew for sure why he stopped, whether it was for a bathroom break or to check his tires or something. All they knew is that he did not get back into the driver's seat, and his car was found idle but still running by a highway patrol cop the next morning. There was a brief search of the area, with sheriff's deputies patrolling the water's edge with their shotguns in hand, but none strayed too deep into the swamps. Not even during daylight hours, because by then there was no doubt a very dark and dangerous affliction had befallen Madison County's Cypress swamps, and no one wanted to be its next victim. But unfortunately for one person, they found themselves in the very unenviable position of being just that, the next potential victim. Wade Thompson was in his 20s at the time, and thanks to a medical condition, had been rejected from joining the military and serving overseas. He made money by helping out women whose menfolk had gone over to fight in Europe or the Pacific. But it seems old Wade's mama forgot to impart a very valuable lesson to him, and that was not to touch what did not belong to him. It turns out Wade was having an affair with a taken woman, and a very risky one at that, because if the woman's husband found out what was going on, either personally or via a letter, then he would no doubt enlist his family, his cousins, and his cousins' cousins in skinning old Wade raw before using whatever was left as gator bait. Wade's lover lived over in Sand Hill, and he would go visit her after dark. He would stay until late enough so no one would see him returning and start asking questions. But this one night, Wade noticed a whole bunch of soldiers guarding the bridge across the reservoir, but not just soldiers either. There were deputies too, and almost every deputy over at the department was either a friend or an acquaintance of his lover's husband. Wade knew that he could not cross the bridge, and that he would have to find another way to get back to Canton that did not involve walking for miles at a time along dark and dusty roads. And so he decided to wade through the swamps up near the Pearl River. Wade knew well that folks had been disappearing out there, and that wading through the swamps at night was very risky. But if he crossed that bridge, and those deputies figured out that he had been staying late at the lovely Mrs. Hale's place, he was going to wish that he was dead before they were finished with him, and so he chose the swamps instead. Wade said he had never been so frightened in all of his life, knowing that he might just run into whatever evil was inhabiting the swamps face to face. He moved quickly and as quietly as possible, making sure to give any gators a nice wide berth. And then, about halfway through, he started hearing this voice carrying through the trees. Wade said, at first it was nothing but a whisper, and he figured it might just be a gator hissing off in the distance. But then he heard it again, and that time it was clear as crystal. Someone off among the trees was saying, "Help me." Wade said he froze on the spot, knowing that he should run, but also knowing that he would not be able to live with himself if he did. He did not have any scruples about lying with another man's wife, but apparently he was not all bad, because instead of just running off and making sure his own skin was saved, he went creeping off into the direction of that voice, the one saying, "Help me, anybody, please," over and over. Wade said he crept forward with nothing but the moonlight to guide him when he suddenly saw a figure right next to a tree, standing on top of what appeared to be some kind of rickety old chair. The man was naked as the day he was born, and even in the moonlight, Wade could see how badly the man had been beaten and possibly even tortured too. He said his body looked like a road map of cuts and purple bruises, and that his face was so swollen that at first it was impossible to recognize him. But then, as he got close, Wade realized who it was. It was young Caleb Reed. But when Wade asked what the hell had happened to him, all Caleb said was, "I am sorry," just as Wade noticed the rope around his neck. Suddenly, a leg flew out from behind a tree, kicking away the chair the naked Caleb was standing on before the air was filled by the sound of the poor boy choking to death. And before Wade had a chance to cut him down with the knife that he was carrying, he was set upon by a trio of white ghostly figures who maintained absolute silence as they tried to wrestle him to the ground. Wade was beaten and strangled as his attackers tried to pin him to the ground, and he realized that they were not trying to kill him. Not yet anyway. Instead, they wanted him alive. He later said that they believed that they caught him unawares, but Wade was already holding his knife when they attacked, and so no sooner had they laid hands on him, but Wade started swinging the blade wildly, slashing and stabbing at all three attackers. They were evidently unprepared for such violent resistance, as Wade managed to best two of the men before the third one ran off into the swamps, still bleeding from the cuts Wade had given him. But the thing that really gives me the creeps, and that gave my grandpa the creeps upon hearing the story, was how those three attackers did not make a single sound, even when Wade drove his knife into one of their chests. And that is all besides what those three men looked like, which is something else which has given me the willies ever since the day that I heard the story told. Much like the so-called spirits that the soldier thought that he saw out in the swamps while he was looking for those German POWs, the bodies of the men who attacked Wade appeared a bright white. It turns out that before they would go hunting for people out there, they would strip down to their drawers and paint their bodies with paste made out of water and white chalk. But neither Wade or anyone else around town, including the sheriff, could figure out why those monsters stayed quiet the whole time. I call them monsters only because my grandpa used that word, but he made it clear that they earned that nickname through their actions alone and not entirely their appearances. They were just men, flesh and blood like you and me. But since nobody claimed them as kin or even claimed to have seen either man before in their lives, nobody figured out who they were or where they were from. It was like they just appeared in those swamps with the sole purpose of capturing, torturing, and killing folks in the worst ways imaginable. As you can imagine, the whole Madison County was in conniptions over Wade's story, not least because a bunch of deputies were able to head out into the swamps, find those chalk-painted bodies, and confirm his story was true. Some folks said that they must have been the German POWs, because who else would go about murdering people like that and doing such strange things and painting themselves white? It sure explained why no one recognized them too. But officially, Camp Clinton would admit to no other escapes and insisted the murderers could not have been German captives. But if that really was true, then who the hell were those murderous animals out there? All kinds of rumors went around among my grandpa and his friends how these men were really monsters or children of the swamp and other such nonsense like that. And he said it made it all the worse by the lack of any kind of official story. Now, this was way back during the war, so the Office of Censorship was in full effect. They had already sent letters around to every newspaper in the country advising them to keep their stories positive or face closure. And this meant the editor of the Madison County Herald did not dare print the story of what happened out in those swamps or the stories of the folks who went missing. And that meant that no one really knew what happened out there for many years till the Office of Censorship closed at the end of the war and people were able to piece together what had happened. My grandpa included. Grandpa ended up moving away from Mississippi to seek his fortune elsewhere. But as long as he lived, he never forgot the story of poor Caleb Reed, those German POWs, and the ghostly figures who made the swamps their human hunting grounds. My great-grandma grew up in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. And let me tell you, she lived one hell of a life. She was born a week after the August hurricane, and her mother called her a miracle baby and said the only reason God saw fit for her survival was to give birth to the most beautiful baby that had ever been born, save for Jesus, of course. And when she was 4, she survived the yellow fever epidemic that killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. And once again, her mama called her a miracle baby because the fever did not take any of her family. Naturally, Grandma Eleanor had no memory of all that, but she did remember the Grand Isle and New Orleans hurricanes that hit when she was 8 and 14, respectively. And then came World War I and the Spanish flu, which killed almost 3,500 people in New Orleans alone. She survived the floods, the droughts, the depression, and lived through a whole bunch more wars. And she had plenty of good stories to tell, but perhaps the most memorable she ever told me was one from Prohibition times, when moonshiners and bootlegging rackets were all over the Louisiana coast. Back then, life was really hard for people in the belly of the bayou. Early mornings meant 5 a.m. in the summertime, 6 a.m. in winter, with rooster cries and yells of "Allons, boo!" from Cajun mothers. Folks were poor too, really poor. So Grandma Eleanor used to go out on progs with her older brother, trapping muskrat, or hauling in red fish and speckled trout while their daddy was at work. Now, folks might not have had much money, but they still wanted to party. So, there was a rich tradition of brewing up homemade wine or straight-up moonshine so people could have something to drink while they danced and fiddled till dawn. But then, Prohibition hit. And when the moonshiners moved their operations out into the bayou, the Bureau of Prohibition followed them. And then what followed was a bloody game of cat and mouse. The chief of police tried to keep his boys out of what was turning into a bloody battle of attrition between the Bureau and the bootleggers. But that could only last so long. One night, one of the parish police officers came stumbling through the door, having been shot through the gut by a bootlegger he had been unlucky enough to stop. The officer had not even been looking for bootleg liquor. He just wanted to make sure that the driver was not drunk, since he was driving so late. But since the bootleggers were in their total war mentality after fighting the Bureau so intensely, the man just reached for his pistol, shot the officer through the stomach, and then drove off. The man's fellow officers tried rushing him to the hospital up in New Orleans. And word has it, he was alive and talking when they got him there. But sadly, he lost way too much blood during surgery, and he passed away on the operating table. The chief and his boys were furious. They did not agree with Prohibition, not just because they respected the tradition of home brewing, but because they enjoyed a drink or two themselves. And this meant, at first, it was their unofficial policy not to enforce it. But after one of their officers was killed, that all changed. The chief of police, a man named Harlan Everett, knew that the key to beating the bootleggers was winning the parish's trust. Not that the people did not trust him to enforce the law. They just did not trust that he could keep them safe from men who rode by night to seek retribution against those that had wronged them. See, the bootleggers owned the night, and they ruled by fear and mistrust. Everyone knew that anyone working with the Bureau would end up having some kind of accident, or in more serious cases, have their brains blown out while they slept to send a message. But no one knew exactly who was in the bootleggers' pay and who was not. See, it was not just a hardcore group of old Cajuns hiding out in the bayou. They had friends and relatives looking out for them, as well as paid lookouts who only wanted to make a few bucks. And that meant that there were never any tips, never any sightings or witnesses, and why the bootleggers were always one step ahead of the law, somehow. But this led Chief Everett to do something pretty radical. He approached the New Orleans Temperance League, a very well-funded group which promoted sobriety, and asked them to sponsor a reward system for anyone who helped bring the bootleggers to justice. Unsurprisingly, the league was only too happy to help, meaning Chief Everett was able to ride up and down Plaquemines Parish, announcing rewards for anyone who approached his officers with information. And at first, they got nothing but a handful of bogus reports and tended to throw them off. But then, one of the parish officers approached the chief talking about a girl down in Potash who wanted to talk to him about the bootleggers. He said it was real important, and what she had to say involved one of the lead bootleggers having an after-hours sit-down meeting with a wealthy New Orleans financier in the saloon she worked at. There was just one condition. She would only talk if they gave her a ride up to Belchas in the middle of the night, after guaranteeing the safety of both her and her family. Chief Everett gave the officer the go-ahead to drive down to Potash in the middle of the night and deliver the girl to safety. But that very same night, when the officer arrived at the girl's home, they found her mama in a state talking about how she had not come home that evening. She was not missing for long, the poor thing. She showed up the next morning when a fisherman up near the town of Empire spotted her body floating in the Mississippi, and the whole parish was as horrified as it was furious. But they did not need to ask Chief Everett to do anything about it, because he already had a plan. He was going to head out into the bayou with a handful of his officers, find the first bootleg liquor still they could, and then blow it up to smithereens with some dynamite that they brought along with them. And if there were any bootleggers unlucky enough to be around at the time, they were going to face Chief Everett's wrath. The chief waited a couple of nights, long enough for the bootleggers to start feeling safe again. And then he gathered up half a dozen of his officers armed with rifles and shotguns, as well as their sidearms, and then led them out into the swamps under the cover of darkness. The chief knew the area well, and the men he had picked to join him were all accomplished outdoorsmen. They crept through the bayou on cat's paws, slowly getting deeper and deeper, until they could not see lights from the parish townships anymore. They stayed quiet as mice, avoiding patches of mud and water, while never once daring to shine a light or talk louder than a whisper. And then, after maybe an hour or two more, they smelled wood smoke and realized that they were close. Chief Everett and his boys kept on moving till they found a moonshiner's shack, and then they slowly closed in till they had it surrounded. Then on the chief's signal, they rushed the shine shack with their weapons at the ready, only to find it empty. There was a fire burning under the still, and even a whole bunch of mash in there, slowly brewing up. But there were no moonshiners, at least none that the chief and his boys could see, because the next thing they knew, they themselves were surrounded and caught in a bootlegger ambush. One of the officers went down right away when a bullet almost took his arm off. Then another took a bullet when he tried to return fire and win the officers a little slack. If they did not fight their way out of there, if they did not do something, they were all going to die. And Chief Everett knew it. He grabbed one of his wounded men's sidearms. Then, carrying a pistol in each hand, he ordered his men to all open fire at once to give him enough free air to slip away. And the plan worked like a charm. And the chief was able to slip out of the ambush site without any of the bootleggers realizing he had moved. The chief could have just as easily escaped and left his men to die. But he never was the type of man to hide a yellow streak on his belly. And when the chief circled around on foot, moving as fast as he could, the bootleggers did not expect anyone to be behind them. They were too busy and far too excited shooting at the shine shack and trying to kill police officers. Some of them were executed point blank without even turning around to see who was killing them. The chief killed one bunch and then ran on to the next, taking each group from the rear, so they did not even know what was hitting them. And then, slowly but surely, as the ambushers were put down, till the rest realized the game was up and they fled into the darkness of the bayou. Once reunited with his boys, Chief Everett ordered one to escort both wounded men back to the parish, and then, after that, he and his 3 remaining officers ran roughshod through the bayou, blowing up shine shacks and shooting down bootleggers like they were a bunch of wild Indian braves. They stayed out there for a whole another night too, running on pure adrenaline and their love of justice. And then, when all was said and done, the chief could boast that 11 shine shacks had been blown to bits. Upon his return to Belchas, the chief told his wife to take their young daughter and go find some place to hide out in New Orleans. The bootleggers, or at least what was left of them, would no doubt seek their revenge against the chief and his men, and he did not want his kinfolk around town when they did. He put them in a car and covered them with blankets too, so folks could not see what or who was being transported. And then after that, he went and got himself a few hours of sleep before he and his boys went back out in the bayou to do it all over again. And the story has it that the chief and his officers went back out near the site of the ambush when they spotted two bodies floating in the water nearby. One of the officers figured that it might be two of the bootleggers that they put down 2 nights ago, but they did not have any flashlights on them to confirm it, so they got up way too close instead. That is when one of the officers says in a voice that sounded thick with horror, "Oh my God, do not look, Chief, do not look." But it was too late. The chief had already recognized the bodies of the woman and child floating in the water, for they belonged to his wife and his daughter. Folks say that the chief went mad with grief right then and there. His wife and kid had been dead and floating for hours out there, so there was no bringing them back. But that sure did not stop the chief from trying. He pulled them out of the bayou and then tried clearing their lungs and breathing air into them. But when he started pushing on their chest to clear out the water, it was not water that came out of their mouths. What came out had this kind of chemical tinge to it, in a way half-stagnant bayou water could never be, because the chief's wife and daughter had not drowned. They were already dead when they were tossed into the water. What came out of their mouths that night was moonshine. Someone had murdered them and then filled their lungs with bootleg liquor. Once he was sure they were dead, and there was no bringing them back, Chief Everett supposedly went very quiet. His boys kept asking him what they should do, but he did not say a word in response. The chief was not even fighting back tears. He was just quiet, like the loss had completely broken him, and then, with his wife over one shoulder and his daughter over the other, he walked off into the bayou, never to be seen again. No one ever saw him out there, but folks knew that the chief was out in the bayou still hunting down bootleggers. You would see the smoke trails in the morning rising up from the thicker parts of the swamp, and you would know that he had been busy. They would find the bodies too, bodies of bootleggers that had been tortured to death. They would be missing their scalps, their noses, and sometimes their whole jaws had been ripped out. But that last part had a practical purpose, because breaking their jaws or chopping and ripping them out entirely made it much easier for Chief Everett to fill the lungs of the dying with the same moonshine they filled the lungs of his wife and daughter with. The killing and burning continued for a few weeks, and all the while, people would be heading out into the bayou, trying to find him and bring him home. But old Chief Everett was never found, and the only thing folks would find was the evidence of his blood-soaked work. My great-grandma knew that story like the back of her hand because she had heard it told and retold dozens of times by the man that she later married. His name was Caleb, and he was one of the men shot during the ambush Chief Everett saved them from, and he went on to become my great-grandfather. Sadly, I never got to meet him, and I only met my great-grandma when I was just a baby. So, I do not have any solid memories of any times we spent together. But just knowing their story and the story of Chief Everett's righteous revenge is enough for me to feel connected to them. And it is through knowing our kin and our history that we get to know ourselves better. Hey, let's read. Big fan. I think I got a fishing story of mine that you might enjoy, and I know fishing is not exactly the scariest of subjects outright, but I promise you, this one's got some bite to it. Many years ago, my buddy Wes went out fishing in the Great Dismal Swamp out here in North Carolina. Now, for those that do not know, The Great Dismal is basically a huge stretch of murky water, along with these cypress trees, Spanish moss, and humidity that is so thick it feels like the air is weighing on you. It is a really beautiful place when the weather is fine, but it is wild too. And while that definitely helps give it an almost creepy sort of vibe, it sure is a fine place to catch some fish, I will tell you. Now, it was one of those overcast, drizzly days that is perfect for fishing. And so we figured that we would head out with our John boat, our rods, and a cooler full of bait to see what we could bring home. Now I had some night crawlers and some stink bait that I whipped up myself. Then, of course, we brought along a 6-pack or 2 of them cheap beers to make the hours slip past a little quicker. And to us, there was nothing better than sitting out there, lines in the water, waiting for a bite while we talked out all of our problems and just watch the world go by. And so we went out whenever we could, especially when the weather was right for it. And that day was no different. We pushed off from the bank around mid-morning, motor chugging away as quiet as we could to make it so that we did not spook away all the fish. And some days, when the weather is nice, the Great Dismal can be a real pretty place. But on days like that one, where there was nothing but light rain and grey clouds overhead, you can bet your ass it earned its name. It gets so dismal that it, for real, gets a little creepy at times, especially when it is all quiet and there is nothing but the sound of bayou bugs buzzing near your ear while they try to drink your blood. We both used a ton of bug spray, and that mostly did the trick in keeping them off you. It is creepy as hell knowing that there are little vampires flying around, but having so many around means you are in prime catfish territory, because when the rains come down and the bugs start hitting the water, it is feeding time. And since we had grown up together, Wes and I had been fishing together since we were small. And so we knew all the spots. We anchored up in this little cove where the water was still deep and then started casting out our lines. We caught a couple of small ones right off the bat. Nothing to write home about, but enough to get us hungry for bigger and better fish. Things were going just fine till Wes was telling me about the time he hooked a bass as big as a hog over at Fontana Lake. And in the middle of the story, he made this big gesture to show me how he did something. And he knocked his beer off the edge of the boat and into the water. It hit the water and started sinking fast with the bubbles trailing up like they were mocking him. But then Wes, being the stubborn son of a gun that he is, was not about to let a perfectly good cold one go to waste. He whipped off his boots and socks, took his shorts off, and then hopped into the water. I think he figured the water would be no higher than his waist, because in most places the swamp is nice and shallow. But we must have drifted off into a deeper spot, because when he dropped, the water went all the way up to his chest. I am laughing at first, saying that I hope that beer was worth getting soaked. And then, as he is wading over to where the beer was, something knocked him off balance and he let out a scream. The water near him starts churning up like a washing machine on spin cycle. And Wes's arms were flailing all wild before he yelled out, "Something's got me!" My heart jumped into my throat, because I am thinking it was a gator maybe, or one of them big water snakes that lurks in the roots. I grabbed an oar, ready to whack at whatever it was, and leaned over the side, ready to swing. But as I did, Wes came leaping towards me through the water with one of his hands reaching out towards me. I grabbed his hand and hauled him up onto the boat. And then he just kind of laid there gasping with his face red as a beet. He is drenched from head to toe, breathing heavy and letting loose a string of cuss words that will make a sailor blush. And I asked him what the hell had gotten him, and he just shook his head like he did not have a clue. Then we cranked the motor and peeled out of there faster than scalded dogs. Now, once we were back on solid ground, safe and sound, with the boat tied up, Wes rolled up his pant leg to check the damage. There was this big, ugly red scrape running across his calf. Raw as hell, but not bleeding too much. Those were not no regular teeth marks either, not the ones that you might expect. They were rough, like somebody took a sheet of sandpaper and rubbed it hard across his skin a bunch of times. I know those kind of marks anywhere because they come from a catfish bite, and there is not no mistaking it. But here is the kicker. The span of that bite went from knee to ankle on the back of his leg, meaning the catfish had to be pushing at least 12 feet long to make a mark that big. But that does not make a single lick of sense because there is no flathead or channel cat in those swamps that can get anywhere near that size. The record around here is maybe 5 or 6 feet on a good day. But that thing, it had to be a goddamn monster. And since swamp waters are full of all kinds of nasty bugs and bacteria, neither of us was about to take any chances with a wound like that. And so, after getting Wes into the truck, we hauled ass over to a hospital. It was a real bumpy ride at first, because we had to get off the back roads, and the whole time Wes was complaining about how his leg was throbbing like a bad tooth. And we got to the ER, checked in, and then the doc took a look at Wes's leg. He obviously did not need any stitches, but it turned out his tetanus shots were way overdue. They jabbed him with a fresh one, and then, while we are sitting in the sterile waiting room, Wes cannot keep his mouth shut. He starts regaling the nurses and anybody who will listen with the whole story. Now the beer drop, the underwater tussle, and how we thought that it was a giant catfish that nearly made him miss supper. Now, people started chuckling at first, thinking it is just another fish story. But then he started telling it back home, too. And, in a small town like ours, word gets around fast. And when it did, it was like we lit the fuse on some powder keg. And by that weekend, half the county was abuzz with talk of some legendary catfish hiding out in the Dismal. Fishermen from all over started flocking to the spot we described, and not just amateurs either. We spotted guys with fancy sonar and heavy-duty tackle, and retired guys who had put all their time into fishing. And each and every one of them was clearly hoping it would be them to reel the beast in. It turned into a full-blown fishing frenzy with coolers and beers and campfires on the banks. Local bait shops ended up selling out of big hooks and line, and even local news picked up on it, saying it was the Dismal Monster Hunt. Now, Wes and I stayed clear, laughing about the chaos we started. But as the days dragged on and nobody hooked the thing, folks started turning skeptical. Whispers turned to accusations, with folks saying that we had done nothing but tell a tall tale, and that hurt a bit. I cannot lie because we knew what we saw. Wes's bite mark healed up just fine, but that old catfish, he is probably still down there in the depths, growing bigger by the year. Those things can live 80 years easy, some say even longer. And so one day, mark my words, somebody is going to cross paths with it again. But until then, Wes and I will just keep our story between friends, knowing the truth is out there, lurking quietly in the Great Dismal. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. And you might even hear your story featured on the next one. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to the podcast. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, fish do not